Dessa Vane counted the coins twice because the first count had been wrong and the second count was worse. $16.09 and a brass button from Hollis's winter coat that she kept in the tin because putting it anywhere else had seemed last October like burying him a second time. She pressed her thumb against the button's face and felt the eagle stamped into its surface, worn almost smooth now from all the time she had held it in the dark. After the children fell asleep and the cabin went quiet, and the missing came on like weather moving in from the north, slow, inevitable arriving before you could board the windows. The morning light through the single window showed her what she already knew. The flour sack hung from its hook on the rafter slack and shapeless, a quarter full at best. The salt pork hook had been bare since Tuesday. The potato bin held 6 shriveled pieces that had sprouted gray tendrils in the Arkansas heat, reaching over the rim like fingers searching for something to grab onto. Dessa had stopped eating potatoes 3 days ago so the children could have them for 1 more week. She had not told the children this. She had told them she wasn't hungry. Rue spoke from the corner where she sat on the packed earth floor. Both cornhusk dolls in her lap, their yarn hair braided with the serious attention of a child who understood that some things required ceremony even when everything else was falling apart. The girl was 5 years old and already carried her father's jaw, that square, stubborn set that made her look like she was working through a problem even in sleep. "Mama, can we have butter on the bread today?" Dessa slid the coins back into the tin. She pressed the lid down with her thumb until it clicked, then placed the tin on the highest shelf, the one Clem couldn't reach without a chair and couldn't reach with a chair without her hearing him drag it. Feeling rich was dangerous. Feeling rich made you believe tomorrow was going to differ from today, and Dessa had learned 6 months ago that tomorrow was just today with less flour in the sack. No butter sugar, but there's molasses. Rue considered this the way a judge considers a plea that falls short of what justice requires. Molasses isn't butter. Her voice carried no complaint, only fact, the flat assessment of a child who had already learned the difference between what was available and what was wanted. Dessa turned from the shelf. "No, it isn't." The door opened and Clem came in with the morning water, 2 buckets from Blackthorn Creek, 2 miles each way, which meant he had been walking since the darkness before dawn when the stars were still sharp enough to cut yourself on. His sandy hair clung dark with sweat at the temples. There was a blister on his right palm he had been hiding for 3 days by keeping that hand in his pocket whenever Dessa looked directly at him. 8 years old, carrying 4 gallons of water, his shoulders beginning to curve forward under the weight into a shape that asked the same silent question every single morning. She looked past him through the open door to the post marking Hollis's grave at the bottom of the hill. 6 months in the ground. Not a disease with a name you could shake your fist at. Not a wound from a war. Not a fall from a horse. Typhoid from the public well in Cutter's Bluff. Hollis had drunk from it on a Thursday afternoon after filing paperwork at the land office, and he was dead by the following Wednesday. The last thing he said to Dessa that was not fever talking was this land will feed us. She had believed him. She had stood beside his bed and held his hand and believed every word because Hollis Vane had never lied to her, not once in 11 years of marriage, and she could not imagine he would choose the week he died to start. The land had not fed them. The land had cracked open like broken pottery and shown its dry bones to the August sun. Now Dessa was counting $16.09 and a brass button, and the only water on 40 acres was what her 8-year-old son carried on his back from a creek 2 miles away. The irony had weight she felt in her sternum some mornings. Hollis killed by contaminated water. His family now depending for survival on whether she could find water clean enough to keep them alive. God had a sense of humor, Grandmother Hattie used to say while rolling biscuit dough in a Tennessee kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried sage. He just keeps the punchline to himself until you're too far into the joke to walk out. It was then the horse came up the ruts. Dessa recognized the animal before she saw it clearly. Gideon Pratt's sorrel mare, a big chestnut that was fat, sleek, and glossy in a season when every other horse in 3 counties was showing ribs like piano keys. The animal's hooves on the dry earth carried the particular sound of a man who did not lie awake worrying about tomorrow because he owned a portion of it. Owned the portion and rented the rest to people who could not afford to say no. 3 short knocks. Polite. Polite the way a thing with teeth is polite to a thing without them. "Mrs. Vane, a word." Dessa wiped her hands on her apron, touched the top of Rue's head once, and opened the door. Gideon Pratt stood on her porch in a charcoal frock coat already beaded with trail dust along the hem. His gold watch chain caught the morning sun and threw a sliver of light across Dessa's floor like a knife laid down casually on a table to make a point without saying a word. Under one arm, he carried a leather portfolio, the kind that snapped shut with a brass clasp. His eyes moved across her kitchen in the half-second the open door allowed, and she watched him count what she had. She watched him add up the flour sack and the bare salt pork hook and the potato bin and the 2 buckets of creek water and arrive at a number, and she watched him be satisfied with that number because it was exactly the number he had ridden 2 miles to find. He came in without waiting for an invitation. He set the portfolio on the pine table Hollis had built their first winter on this land when they still believed the ground beneath them had made promises it intended to keep. Pratt laid the clasp open with one finger and placed a fountain pen beside it, a silver-barreled pen with mother-of-pearl inlay along the cap, the kind that cost $8 at any stationery counter in Little Rock. Dessa had seen one like it once in the desk drawer of the station master at Cutter's Bluff. More than half of what she had in the tin on the shelf. Pratt set the pen, the way a card player sets down aces slowly face up, so you understood the game had already been decided and what remained was only the formality of manners. $30 for the full 40 acres. I'll have the deed drawn up by Friday. You and the children can be east of the river by Sunday evening. Dessa stood very still. Behind her, Clem had moved close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the back of her dress. Rue had drifted to the edge of the table and was watching the pen the way a child watches a snake that hasn't yet decided which direction to move. My husband filed a homestead claim on this land, Mr. Pratt, 2 years completed of 5. And then he died, Mrs. Vane. His voice carried the tone of a man delivering bad news he had rehearsed in a mirror. Which I was genuinely sorry to hear. A widow may complete her husband's claim under the statute, as you're aware, but completion requires improvements. One finger rose. It requires crops. A second finger. It requires water. His eyes moved to the window, to the brown cracked square that had been her kitchen garden in May, then further to the 40 acres of dry hillside stretching behind the cabin like a promise someone had broken and simply walked away from. Rue had gotten close to the table. Pratt looked down at her and offered a smile, the specific kind a man produces for a small person whose hunger he is counting on as leverage. It was a smile that calculated. It was a smile that measured the distance between what the child needed and what her mother could provide. Rue did not smile back. She looked at him with her father's jaw set hard, then turned away and pressed her cornhusk doll against her chest with both arms. 5 years old, and she already knew. She knew the way animals know when the air shifts before a storm, not through reasoning, but through something older and more reliable than thought. My offer closes in 3 days, ma'am. After that, I have other widows to visit. He said it the way a man reads a train schedule. Tuesday, the Vane place. Wednesday, the Heenan widow on South Fork. Thursday, the Dawson claim. The county will take this land for back taxes in October. You'll receive nothing at all. He rose from the table, tucked the portfolio under his arm, tipped his hat in the doorway. His body blocked the light for a moment, and in that moment, the cabin went dark. And Dessa understood with complete clarity that this was what he was selling, not $30, not a transaction, but this specific feeling, this shadow. The knowledge that a man could stand in your doorway and make the sun disappear. A sensible woman, he said, will have signed by supper tonight. She stood in the open doorway after he rode out, watching the dust from his horse settle across the track. She did not close the door because closing it felt like agreeing that she was trapped inside. 20 minutes later, Selah Drum's wagon came along the track from the east. Selah had sold her place to Pratt 2 weeks back. Her wagon was piled high with furniture, bedding a crate of chickens, and the iron stove her husband had left behind when he walked off the claim in June. Selah reined up and squinted through the glare, 35 years old, sun-cracked, with hands that looked like they had been fighting the ground for a decade and losing every single round. You sign yet, Dessa? Not yet, Selah. Sign, honey. Her voice carried no judgment, only exhaustion. There's nothing out here worth dying for. Not a stone, not a fence post, not a memory you couldn't carry in your coat pocket. Take his $30 and get those babies to your people before the cold comes and finds you empty. The wagon rolled on east. Dessa watched until it became a dark smudge on the white road, then watched the place where the smudge had been, then watched nothing at all. then finally closed the door. That afternoon, Mabry Sutton came walking up the track from the neighboring hollow. 60 years old, widowed, 3 years, thin as a fence rail, with gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it drew her eyebrows into an expression of perpetual, mild surprise. She had known grandmother Hattie back in Tennessee, had sat in Hattie's kitchen drunk. Hattie's coffee, listened to Hattie's stories about water and trees and the things the earth told you if you had the sense to shut your mouth long enough to hear them. Mabry brought a jar of pickled cucumbers and a piece of advice. She set the jar on the table where Pratt's pen had rested 2 hours earlier. Hattie would have told you to fight back Dessa. A pause waited with something the older woman couldn't quite put down. But Hattie also died in Tennessee, not here, not in this particular kind of hard. Dessa looked at her. Do you think I should sign Mabry? The silence that followed had the weight of a woman who had survived her own drought, her own grief, and had come out the other side with opinions she didn't want to impose but couldn't entirely contain. I think you should live, Mabry said at last. How you do that is your business. Mabry left. Dessa stood in the kitchen and felt lonelier than she had before the old woman arrived, because the counsel of someone who refuses to choose for you carries more weight than the threats of an enemy. An enemy at least tells you where he stands. A friend who won't take sides leaves you alone in the middle of the road with traffic coming hard from both directions. That night, after the children were asleep, Dessa sat by a single candle at the pine table. She had told herself she would sign in the morning. She had told herself this 7 times and believed it none of them. Each time the decision tried to settle in her chest, something pushed back against it, something that felt like grandmother Hattie's hand on the back of her neck, the way it used to feel in that Tennessee kitchen when Dessa was a girl and Hattie was teaching her to read the world the way most people only learn to read books. She opened grandmother Hattie's leather notebook. The notebook was 40 years old. The leather was cracked at the spine, soft as worn cloth where Hattie's hands had held it 10,000 times. Hattie had written in it with 2 distinct hands across the decades, her young hand round and careful, the penmanship of a woman taught by a schoolteacher, mother. That letters were a form of respect, and her old hand slanted spare, stripped of decoration, the penmanship of a woman who had run out of time for anything but the truth. The page the notebook opened to was a page Dessa did not remember reading before. Where the biggest tree stands in dry country, there is water running where eyes cannot see it. Don't you ever forget that, sugar. The tree is just the cup the earth drinks out of. Dessa lifted her head. Through the small window, silver under a 3/4 moon, she could see the oak. It had stood on her hillside before Arkansas was Arkansas, before the Louisiana Purchase, before the Republic had a name. 4-foot trunk, 120 feet of crown. Leaves still dark green in the worst drought any living soul in Boone County could remember. Everything else had gone brown, the grass, the garden, the creek beds cracked like old pottery. But that oak was green. Green the way something that should not be possible goes ahead and happens anyway, without apology, without explanation. She closed her eyes. She was 10 years old, barefoot on a Tennessee hillside in July, the sun a white fist in the sky. Grandmother Hattie had her by the wrist, and Hattie's grip was iron, and Hattie was pressing a forked willow switch into Dessa's palm. The tree isn't hiding the water, baby. The tree is drinking it same as us. You learn to see what's feeding something that big, and you'll never be truly thirsty in this life. Hattie's other hand, skin like brown paper stretched over bird bones, tapped Dessa's forehead. Most folks look at a tree and see a tree. You look at a tree and see the river they can't find. That's your gift, sugar. Don't you waste it. The willow switch had dipped in Dessa's hand over a hollow beside a sycamore. A tremor so faint she thought she had imagined it. Hattie had said quietly, "There." They dug with a hand spade and a tin cup and found water at 6 feet, cold and clean, tasting of limestone and old roots. Dessa opened her eyes. She looked at the oak through the window for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been seeing every day without truly seeing the moment you finally understand what it's been trying to tell you all along. She closed the notebook. She did not sign. The storm came down from the north. It began a little past midnight as heat lightning behind the ridge, silent flashes that lit the trees in blue-white for half a second, then left them darker than before. Dessa watched from the window while Clem and Rue slept. By 1 in the morning, the wind had turned. By 2 o'clock, the oak on the hillside was bending in a way no oak that age had any business bending its branches, whipping across the sky like arms trying to hold on to something being pulled away with great and terrible force. At 2:15, a sound came that was not exactly a sound so much as a sensation beneath the soles of her feet. A long, low groan, deep coming from the ground itself. The sound of something that had stood for 200 years, deciding finally that standing was finished. The cabin floor shuddered. The tin on the high shelf rattled against the wood. Then a crash rolled down the hillside, passed under the cabin, passed through Dessa's bones, and stopped her breath entirely. "Mama!" Rue, reaching up from the straw mattress in the dark. Dessa picked her up. Clem pressed himself against her side, his body rigid, his muscles locked the way a boy's muscles lock when he is trying very hard not to be afraid in front of his mother. "Hush now, it's just weather." It was not just weather. She sat awake through the remainder of the storm with Rue in her lap and Clem against her ribs. She did not let them see her shaking. She did not let them hear her praying. When the wind found a gap under the door and blew the candle out, she held them both in the dark and said nothing, because there was nothing available to say that would have been true. Dawn came gray, clean wet. The air held the smell of turned earth, broken wood rain on hot stone. Dessa pulled her shawl over her nightdress, told the children to stay inside, and opened the door. She had braced herself for ruin. The porch collapsed. The root cellar caved. The 3 remaining hens scattered to the wind. She had braced herself completely, and she had already begun composing in her mind the walk to Cutter's Bluff, the words she would speak to Pratt when she finally put her name on his paper. She found none of that. What she found was the oak. It lay on its side across the middle of her 40 acres, 120 feet of trunk and canopy stretched across the wet grass like something ancient that had finally chosen to rest. Its crown was still impossibly green, the leaves glistening with rain. But where the roots had been, where that 4-foot trunk had anchored itself into the Arkansas earth for 2 centuries or more, there was something Dessa had never seen in her 32 years of life. A vertical wall of earth 15 feet tall, 12 feet wide, 4 feet thick. A curved shelf of tangled dark roots holding packed Ozark clay, and stone ripped up from deep below and turned to face the sky like the palm of a hand opened in offering. The root ball, massive, still dense, still holding together, was dark with soil it had lived inside for longer than anyone alive could account for. At the base of it, where the trunk had once met the ground, there was a crater. 4 feet across, 3 feet deep, water was coming up out of it. Clear water, cold water, water rising through the broken earth in steady rhythmic pulses like a heartbeat. Water that tasted, when Dessa knelt and cupped it in her palm and brought it to her lips, of limestone and pine needles and something older than Grandmother Hattie's grandmother. Something that had been waiting down there in the dark for a very long time, held in place by the roots of a tree that had been drinking it for 200 years. The tree was down. The water was free. It was coming up to find the sun. Dessa sat down in the wet grass beside the crater. The sun came over the ridge and hit the surface of the water, and the water threw the light back at the sky like a mirror. She sat in that reflected light and did not move for a long time. She sat the way you sit when something has happened that your body understands before your mind catches up to it, still breathing, waiting for the rest of yourself to arrive. "Mama." Clem in the cabin doorway, hair standing up, squinting against the morning light. "Mama, the tree. I see it, baby." He came down the hill in bare feet, picking his way carefully through storm-broken branches until he stood beside her. He looked at the root wall, looked at the crater and the water rising in it, looked at the root wall again. His mouth was open in the specific way children's mouths open when something has exceeded the boundaries of what they believed the world capable of producing. Dessa put her hand on the top of his head. She could feel his pulse through his skull, quick, warm, steady. His voice came out smaller than usual, the voice of a boy standing at the edge of something large. "Mama, it looks like a house with no front wall." Dessa kept her hand where it was. She looked at the root wall, at the crater, at the water still rising. The words came from somewhere below, thought, "That's because the front wall hasn't been built yet." At 9 o'clock in the morning, Heber monks rode past on the ridge road. The storekeeper from Cutter's Bluff, a round man with a florid face who sweated through his collars in every season, who made it his business to know everyone else's business, because in a small county, information about other people's circumstances was its own reliable currency. He reined up when the fallen oak caught his eye and made a clicking sound with his tongue. that was meant to convey sympathy, but actually conveyed the satisfaction of a man who is pleased when something bad happens to someone else because it confirms his belief that the world operates on a system of inevitable decline. Pure ruin, Vane. Pure and complete ruin. He shook his head slowly, performing grief he did not feel. You should have taken Pratt's offer yesterday. He won't give you 30 now with this mess to clear. Then, with the precision of a man who knows the exact value of information delivered at the right moment, he'll be out collecting signatures all week. You have a blessed day, Mrs. Vane. My condolences on the tree. He clucked at his horse and rode on. Dessa waited until the sound of his hooves disappeared beyond the ridge. She turned and looked at Clem, who was watching her with his shoulders already set in the posture of a boy bracing to absorb his mother's grief. Instead, his mother laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was not a polished laugh. It came from somewhere deep in her chest, from the same place the grief lived, and it surprised her the way a sneeze surprises you. Involuntary, sudden, impossible to call back once it was out in the open air. It was the laugh of a woman who has just watched the thing she most feared become the thing she needed most, and her body did not know what else to do with that kind of reversal. Clem stared at her. He had been standing with his shoulders shaped for comfort he would no longer be required to give. He didn't know what to do with them now. Go wake your sister. Dessa said, her voice steadier than it had been in 6 months. We have work to do today. Gideon Pratt arrived the following morning a full hour earlier than the day before. The portfolio was the same. The silver-barreled pen was the same. His horse had been brushed. Dessa met him at the door with her hair combed and rue on her hip. $30 stands, Mrs. Vane. I can have this completed by supper. I need 30 days, Mr. Pratt. He drew a slow breath. The breath of a man preparing to explain something elementary to a person he has already decided is incapable of understanding complexity. The breath of a trap being patient. 30 days changes nothing, ma'am. This drought won't break before October. Your children will be thinner. Your cupboard will be emptier. My price drops to 25 on the 1st of September. 30 is the kindness I'm offering today. His eyes moved past her to the hillside where the fallen oak lay in its long green ruin. You haven't even begun clearing this wreckage. You think you can make a crop on a lot with 120 feet of timber lying across it? 30 days, Mr. Pratt. He studied her face the way a man studies a hand of cards he cannot quite read, trying to determine whether the person across the table is bluffing or simply doesn't understand that the game has already been decided. He concluded that 30 days of a widow alone on a ruined claim would accomplish his work for him. 30 days of heat and hunger and the grinding arithmetic of poverty would deliver her back to this door more desperate than she stood today. Desperation was Pratt's inventory, the raw material of his particular trade, the thing he bought cheap and sold at a considerable margin. He almost smiled. He nodded once. 30 days, September 1st, Mrs. Vane, not 1 hour more. His horse had not finished turning on the track before Dessa was on her knees on the cabin floor with Grandmother Hattie's notebook spread open across her lap, and both children crouched on either side of her like conspirators. Like the three of them were planning a robbery, which in the way that mattered most, they were, except what they intended to steal was their own future from a man who had already counted it as his property. Look here, Dessa said. Both of you look closely. She spread the notebook open beside a piece of charcoal and the blank back of a flour sack. She drew as she spoke, sketching lines and measurements with her hand moving in long, sure strokes, the plan coming out of her the way water comes out of a spring from somewhere deep pressurized ready. The cabin would go inside the root cavity using the upturned root ball itself as the back wall. Oak planks from the fallen trunk for the side walls, 14 by 10 feet. A south-facing door, a cedar shake roof. Then following what Hattie had written about Ozark Springs, a stone basin around the crater. Then a channel 80 feet down the natural slope. Then the garden 30 by 40 feet. Corn, beans, squash, tomatoes in the full southern sun. She pressed her palm flat over the charcoal sketch and looked at both of them. This is going to take us 30 days, maybe 28 if we push. We are not going to tell anyone what we are doing. Not Selah Drum, not Mr. Monks, not the Reverend, not a single living person until Mr. Pratt rides up that track on September 1st and finds us standing here. Rue's forehead furrowed. Why not tell? Because if people know, Mr. Pratt will know. This county has no trail that nobody uses and no conversation that doesn't find its way to a man with money before sundown. If Pratt knows what we're building, he'll find a way to stop us before we finish. But if we look like nothing is happening, if we look exactly like a widow and two children waiting to lose their home, he'll leave us alone until the day we're ready." Dessa laid out the full plan, every step the way Grandmother Hattie had always explained things clearly, without decoration, the way you explain something to people whose lives depend on understanding it correctly. Clem listened with his jaw forward and his eyes on the sketch. "I can do it, Mama." Rue nodded with the gravity of a child who has been waiting her entire 5 years for someone to assign her a task worthy of her attention. "Clem, you're the builder. Rue, you're the foreman." Dessa looked at her daughter. "The foreman keeps everyone honest." Rue considered this. Then she nodded a second time harder, as though she had been offered a position she had known all along was rightfully hers and was only now receiving official confirmation. Dessa closed the notebook. She pressed her palm to the leather cover, the way Hattie used to press her palm to Dessa's forehead to check for fever, a gesture that was both measurement and blessing, the physical expression of, "I am here and I am paying attention, and I will not let you go through this alone." We start at first light. That night, after the cabin had gone quiet and the children's breathing had steadied into sleep, Dessa sat alone at the pine table with the last stub of a candle and the notebook open before her. She turned to the blank page at the back, the page Hattie had never filled. She took the pencil from her apron pocket and wrote in the space that had waited there for years, "Hattie, I don't know if this will hold. I'm doing what you told me. If it doesn't hold, I need you to know I tried. Forgive me for not being enough." She closed the notebook, put her head down on her folded arms. The candle burned lower. She was nearly asleep when a small warm hand touched the back of her neck, the specific gentleness of a child checking to see if the person in front of her is still breathing. Rue standing beside her in the dark, barefoot on the packed earth floor. "Mama, your candle went out." Dessa raised her head. The room was dark, warm, full of the sound of the night insects outside and the steady breathing of Clem on his mattress. She looked at her daughter standing in the blackness with her hand still resting on the back of Dessa's neck, and something loosened inside her chest. Not grief leaving exactly, but grief shifting, making room for what had to come next. She remembered why she was still here. She kept her eyes open in the dark until the first gray light of morning began to show beneath the door. She kept going. The first 3 days reduced them to 3 things that could not be taken away: callous silence, and the particular stubbornness that runs in women who have buried a husband and decided the ground is not getting anyone else. Day 3. Dessa cleared the root cavity by hand. The upturned roots had left behind a space that smelled of broken stone and centuries of darkness, suddenly exposed to air, the smell of a secret the earth had kept so long it had forgotten it was keeping one. She shoveled clumps of clay and small rocks into a flour sack, dragged it out backward on her knees, emptied it downhill, went back in. She filled that sack 41 times. By sundown, her shoulders had moved past pain into a gray numbness, as though her arms had been borrowed from someone else, and that someone had grown tired of the loan. Her hands had opened in 3 places, the skin splitting along the lines where she gripped the shovel handle, the blood drying into something that looked like rust against her palms. Clem brought water without being asked. Rue brought a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, delivered with the formal care of someone presenting evidence in a proceeding. Neither of them said a word about the blood. They were learning something children in hard country learn early, that there are moments when the most loving thing you can do for a person is to pretend you don't see what it's costing them. Day 4, they framed the walls. Dessa cut 14 oak posts from the fallen trunk's smaller limbs, using Hollis's long-handled handsaw, the one with the walnut grip worn smooth by his right hand. Across years of use, she could still feel in the wood's surface. Each post stood 8 feet tall and 4 inches across. Clem held each one steady at the base, while Dessa drove it into the earth floor of the cavity and packed stones around the heel to keep it plumb. The boy had to stand on an upended flour sack to reach the tops of the taller posts, his whole body stretched into a single line of effort, arms overhead, face turned up. When they finished the last post, Dessa sat down on the ground. She could not get back up for 10 minutes. Her legs would not answer. Her back had locked into a shape that didn't include standing. Clem sat down beside her without a word, without offering help, without filling the silence with the kind of talk that people use to cover discomfort. He sat in the quiet with her the way a man sits with another man after hard work, not because there is nothing to say, but because saying would diminish what they had just done together. He was 8 years old, and he understood something about silence that most adults never learn. Some silences are not empty. Some silences are the sound of two people trusting each other enough to be exhausted together without apology. Days 5 through 7 were stone. Limestone broke to flat slabs when you hit it right, pieces the size of dinner plates, twice as heavy. Dessa needed 127 of them. She counted in her head as she carried because counting gave the work a shape, and shape was the difference between labor and punishment. The smallest slab weighed 2 pounds. The largest, the one she and Clem moved together on a stretcher made from a horse blanket and 2 oak poles, weighed 15. Clem took the downhill end because he was shorter and the weight shifted toward him on the slope. He carried it with his jaw set in the expression she was beginning to recognize as his own, not Hollis's jaw exactly, but something derived from it, the same bone structure carrying a different person's determination. On the morning of day 6, Taft Gruber appeared at the cabin, 22 years old, lean with the forearms of a man who swung a hammer for a living. He had bought the blacksmith's forge in Cutter's Bluff 2 years ago, with money Hollis had lent him. No interest, no deadline, no conditions attached. Hollis had said the world needed more men who were good with their hands and fewer who were only good with paper, and he had meant every word. And when he died, the debt died with him as far as Taft was concerned. The obligation, however, did not. Taft's voice was direct without ceremony. "Mrs. Vane, I want to repay what I owe. I can pull timber, drive nails, haul anything that needs moving, whatever the job requires." Dessa looked at his arms, his earnest face, the sweat on his forehead from the walk up the hill. She wanted to say yes, the way a drowning person wants to say yes to an outstretched hand, immediately, completely, without reservation. But she had spent 5 days building something in secret, and secrets only hold when the fewest possible number of people carry them. If you come here regularly, Monks will notice. If Monks notices, Pratt hears about it before supper. "I could take the back way through the hollow. Nobody uses that trail." She looked at him steadily. "You're young Taft. You haven't learned yet that in a county this size there's no trail nobody uses." He stood a moment longer, turning his hat slowly in both hands. Then he reached into the canvas bag he had carried up the hill, set a bundle on the doorstep, and said nothing about it. He simply set it down and nodded and walked back down the slope. The bundle held hand-forged nails, each one straight as a pin, the iron still dark from the quench, the kind of nails a man makes when he wants the thing he is building to last. Dessa looked at the bundle for a long moment. Refusing kindness hurts almost as much as never receiving it at all, because when kindness doesn't arrive, you are at least spared the act of pushing it away. She picked up the nails. She carried them inside. What she did not know, what she would not learn until later, was that Taft Gruber did not simply disappear after that morning. He chose his movements with precision. Twice a week he hunted the hill country north of the Vane property, a reasonable activity in drought season when game moved toward any remaining water. From the high ground he could see the ridge road that Dessa could not observe from below. He could see riders before they became relevant. He could note who paused on the rise to look down at the 40 acres. He said nothing about this arrangement to anyone. He did not consider it heroic. He considered it the minimum a person owed to someone who had refused his help for sound reasons. Day 9. Dessa sawed planks from the fallen trunk, 14 planks each, 7 feet long, 5 inches wide, an inch and a quarter thick. The handsaw dulled twice. She sharpened it with a file her grandfather had given Hollis at their wedding, a gift that had seemed oddly practical at the time and now seemed almost prophetic. Sitting cross-legged in the dirt with the file in her hands, drawing it along each tooth in slow, even strokes, she realized she had not cried once in 9 days. Not because the missing had stopped. The missing of Hollis had not stopped. But it had changed direction. For 6 months it had been a hand pressed against her chest, pushing her backward, pushing her down. Now it was a hand at her back, pushing her through. That night, after Clem and Rue were asleep in the half-finished cavity, not yet a cabin, but something closer to a den, the root wall behind them breathing cold into the hot air. Dessa sat alone at the pine table. She opened Hattie's notebook to the last page, to the words she had written 3 nights before. Below them, in the space remaining, she wrote to Hollis. Instead, "Hollis, you should be here. Your son is doing your work and it is changing the shape of him, and I don't know how much longer I can watch it happen without breaking." She closed the notebook, put her head down on her arms, slept there at the table, did not dream, did not wake until the small warm hand found the back of her neck again, not checking this time but steadying. The difference between those two gestures as clear to her as the difference between a question and an answer. "Mama, your candle went out again." Dessa sat up. She looked at Rue in the darkness and felt something clarify inside her, not resolve exactly, but its physical equivalent, the kind of certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind. She went back to work before sunrise. Day 12, the Basin held. Dessa removed the diverter stone at a little past 10 in the morning, with both children watching, their faces so still, so focused, that they looked like small figures placed on the hillside to mark something sacred. Water rose through the fine gravel bed in 30 seconds. It found the level of the stone lip. It found the overflow notch she had cut into the eastern face. It began to run clear cold without hesitation down the stone-lined channel toward the flat ground where the garden would grow. She timed it with Hollis's pocket watch in a cedar bucket. 3¼ gallons per minute. More than 3 gallons a minute of cold, clean water coming up out of the Ozark earth as though it had simply been waiting to be asked. Clem's whoop was a boy's sound, high, wild, the sound of someone who has been holding his breath for 12 days and has finally been given permission to exhale. Rue ran to the channel and plunged both hands into the flow, then pressed her wet palms against her mother's face. The water on Dessa's cheeks was cold enough to shock. "Mama, it's cold." 54 degrees sugar, year-round. The springs here run at the temperature of the stone they pass through. She looked at her daughter's face, the first full grin she had seen on Rue since Hollis's funeral, wide and unguarded and luminous. "That's colder than anything you've touched in a month." Rue grinned harder. She cupped both hands in the channel and drank from them like an animal without ceremony, because ceremony could wait. The following morning, Dessa rode the mule down to Cutter's Bluff for salt. She needed it for preserving whatever the garden would eventually produce. At Monk's Mercantile, she found Mabry Sutton at the counter buying flour. Monk stood behind his ledger making annotations in the margins, less bookkeeping than surveillance. A careful record of who could afford what, who had credit remaining, who was beginning to come apart at the edges in ways he might one day find useful. "Mrs. Vane." Monks didn't look up. "You haven't signed for Pratt yet." Before Dessa could answer, Mabry spoke. Her voice was thin. It trembled on the edges, but the words were precise. "Dessa is still there, Mr. Monks. She hasn't signed." The words landed on the counter like dropped coins. Monks looked up. His pencil stopped. Dessa watched the information enter his ledger without being written down. Watched it begin its journey from this counter to Pratt's ear by nightfall, moving along the current of small-town knowledge that travels faster than water. Outside, in the white glare of the street, Dessa took Mabry by the hand. The old woman's fingers were shaking. "Mabry, why?" Mabry began to cry without sound, tears moving down the creases of her face like water finding channels it had used before. "Pratt told me if I didn't confirm who hadn't signed, he would reassess the water tax on my well. I have no money, Dessa. I'm 60 years old and I live alone, and I am so frightened of what happens to me if I lose my water." A pause ragged with shame. "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry." Dessa let go of Mabry's hand. Not from anger. She let go because she understood, and understanding was heavier than anger, and she needed both hands free to carry it. Mabry was not a traitor. She was a good woman inside a system designed specifically to find the fracture in good women and press on it until the fracture gave way. Dessa did not blame her. She could not afford blame. Required energy she was rationing now by the tablespoon, allocating only what each task needed, saving the remainder for the task after that. She walked back to the mule. She rode home with salt in the saddlebag, the knowledge that Pratt now knew she was still on the land, and the understanding that she had less time remaining than she had calculated that morning. Day 14. Rue found the green first. She came running up the hillside with her voice arriving ahead of her body, shouting words that didn't resolve into meaning until she was close enough to hear clearly. "Mama, the dead grass is coming back." Along both sides of the channel, a thin, hesitant line of green had stitched itself into the brown earth 4 feet wide on each side where moisture had wicked outward through the soil. The dormant prairie grass, reaching what it needed, had simply resumed. Dessa stood at the edge of that narrow ribbon of living green and looked at it for a long time. Grandmother Hattie had written about this in the notebook, capillary action moisture, pulling through loamy soil 3 to 6 feet out from any constant water source, the earth drawing what it needed sideways the way a lamp wick draws oil upward. It was arithmetic. But watching Rue chase a grasshopper through that 4-foot band of color, a grasshopper that had no reasonable business being alive on the 87th day of drought, Dessa thought that arithmetic, when the numbers finally come out right, is its own particular kind of miracle. Day 16. The cabin was finished enough to sleep in. Dessa lit the small iron stove for the first time. The chimney drew well. The root earth wall at the back acted as a cold mass, pulling excess heat and sending the smoke cleanly upward. At sunset, the interior temperature was 68 degrees. Outside, it was 94. Clem pressed his palm against the root wall. It feels like a cool hand. Rue pressed her hand to the same spot, then leaned in close and sniffed. It smells like dirt and wet rope. A pause. Home is where there's butter. This is where there's wet rope. Clem's voice carried brotherly authority. She's a goose, Mama. Dessa lay on the straw tick mattress she had dragged into the finished space that afternoon, looking up at the cedar shake roof. Your sister's right. It does smell like rope. It's still home. She fell asleep to the sound of them bickering, not scared, not hungry, not measuring every word for how much it might cost. Just two children disagreeing about whether a house smelled like wet rope, which was the most ordinary thing that had happened inside these walls since October. She slept harder than she had slept in 6 months. She should not have. She woke sometime past midnight. Moonlight through the south window laid a square of silver on the cabin floor. Clem's shape was visible on the children's mattress in the corner, but the shape was wrong. Too small. Only Rue breathing slow and steady under the blanket. Dessa got up. She went to the door. She opened it and looked down the hillside in the moonlight. Clem was at the channel. One hand held a cedar splint she had left near the basin. His other hand was lifting stones, small flat ones fitting them into the channel wall where gaps remained. He worked by moonlight. His movements were deliberate, considered the movements of a boy trying very hard not to drop anything, because dropping something would make noise, and noise would wake his mother, and his mother would make him stop. Dessa opened her mouth to call him in. She closed it. She watched him place 7 stones. She watched him pause after each one, flex the working hand, reach for the next. She went back inside. She lay down. She did not sleep again, but she did not go back to the door either. In the morning, she saw that the channel ran 3 feet longer than she had left it, the stones set with a precision she could not have matched herself in good light. At breakfast, cold cornbread, the last of the molasses, she looked at Clem across the table. He looked back at her, then quickly away, the way a person looks away when they don't want to be thanked, because the thanking would make the thing smaller than it was. She did not ask. She did not thank him. She passed him the cornbread. 2 nights later, Rue padded out of bed at midnight looking for Dessa. She found her brother instead. She stood beside him in the moonlight and tugged his sleeve. Clem's voice was low, careful. My hand hurts, but Mama's not sleeping enough, Rue. If I do extra at night, she can stop earlier tomorrow. Rue looked at the stones in his hands, then sat down beside him. She picked up the smallest stones, the ones her 5-year-old fingers could fully wrap around, and placed them where he pointed. They worked in silence until the moon went behind the ridge. Dessa found the evidence in the morning. Stones too small for her own hands, placed with the uneven care of a child who was doing her absolute best with what she had. She stood at the channel for a long time without moving. Day 18. Dessa woke before dawn knowing something was wrong. The spring had a voice, a quiet, constant murmur she had grown accustomed to, the way you grow accustomed to a clock's ticking until the moment it stops. The voice was gone. In its place, nearly nothing. A trickle no wider than her palm winding through the stones and losing itself in the dry earth before it reached the channel's midpoint. She went outside with the lantern. The basin had dropped 2 inches below the overflow rim. She knelt with Hollis's pocket watch over the cedar bucket. 1 2/10 gallons per minute, less than a third of what it had been 6 days ago. Mama. Clem in the doorway, nightshirt, bare feet, Rue wrapped around his leg with her eyes still half closed. Go back inside, sugar. What's wrong with the water? I don't know yet. He came down the hill anyway. He should not have. The stones around the basin were slick with overnight dew, the grip treacherous in ways that hadn't mattered when the ground was dry. His right hand had been overworked for 2 nights running the tendons past their limit. He reached to brace himself against the basin wall. His fingers could not hold. He dislodged a flat stone at the rim. The stone fell 6 inches, directly onto his left forearm. Clem made a small compressed sound, the sound of a creature that has been hurt and does not want to attract the attention of anything larger than itself. He did not cry, he did not shout. Rue screamed. That was how Dessa knew. Rue was 5 years old and had been trained by Drought and Loss not to scream, had learned through the months since October that screaming brought nothing and cost energy she could not spare. For Rue to scream meant what she was seeing exceeded the threshold of everything she had taught herself to absorb. Dessa crossed the stones in 2 strides. She lifted the rock off the arm. The skin had split in a 2-inch line. She pressed the bone carefully with her thumb, cracked but not broken through. A bruise rose beneath the surface like something dark coming up from deep water, coloring the skin in shades that had no business on an 8-year-old's arm. She carried him up the hill, all 60 pounds of him. She laid him on the straw mattress and cleaned the wound with spring water cold enough to slow the swelling before it could fully begin. She tore a 4-inch strip from the hem of her petticoat, split a flat piece of cedar shake for a splint, wrapped the arm from elbow to wrist. Clem made no sound through the entire process, and he did not cry until she was done. Then he cried quietly into her neck the way a boy cries when he is ashamed of the crying but grateful for the neck that receives it. Dessa held him. She said nothing for a long time, then very quietly into his hair. You've been working at night. I know. Your hand was already tired. That's why you slipped. Clem went rigid against her. This is not your fault, baby. But it is not your job either. You are 8 years old. You are not supposed to save us. That is my work. She paused, feeling for the right words, the ones that would land true. Your father did this work every day for 2 years, and it was too much for him, too. The labor didn't kill him. But it took everything he had, and when the sickness came, there was nothing left to fight it with. You are not going to give me that same sorrow twice. She held him until his breathing steadied into sleep. She laid him down with the splinted arm across his chest. She kissed the top of Rue's head. She went back to the basin. The notebook gave her nothing on failing flow. She turned pages backward and forward. Then 2 pages before the spring entries under a heading Hattie had written for a different problem entirely. A well gone muddy after heavy rain, she found it lay a bed of pebble the size of a baby's fist at the inlet, and the silt will catch there and the water will learn to find its way through as through a sieve. Not at the surface, at the inlet, the place where water actually entered the basin from below. The storm that had felled the oak had also churned fine silt into every underground passage the water traveled through. The initial flow had been the clean rush, the first release of pressure after 200 years. Now the silt was catching in the narrower channels. The flow was not dying, it was being choked from within. Day 19. Dessa emptied the basin stone by stone, bucketed the water out by hand, and by late afternoon found what she was looking for, 4 inches below the original earth, a spot where water bubbled through a visible funnel of silted clay. She pushed her arm in, past the elbow, cleared the silt with her fingers, packed in a 6-inch bed of pea gravel she had collected from Blackthorn Creek on the same trip she had bought salt. Day 20 the flow returned, 3 1/5 gallons per minute. Day 23 it stabilized, 3 1/2, stronger than it had ever run. Day 24. Rue filled a tin cup at the channel and carried it up the hill with both hands, walking with the slow, deliberate care of a child transporting something irreplaceable. She held it out to Dessa, who was sitting in the open cabin doorway with Clem asleep against her shoulder, his splinted arm resting across her lap. Papa would be proud, Mama. Dessa took the cup. She drank half of it. She set it on the threshold. She put her free hand over her face, the hand not holding her son, and cried for 10 minutes without making a sound. The tears ran between her fingers and fell onto the threshold wood and dried in the heat within a minute. When they were gone, she stood up, laid Clem down gently on the mattress, kissed the top of Rue's head, and walked back down the hill to finish the last 12 feet of channel. Day 25. Morning. Clem, unable to do heavy work with the splinted arm, but constitutionally incapable of being without purpose, walked the basin perimeter the way he did each morning, now checking stones for shift-measuring water level with his notched stick. He stopped, crouched, called for Dessa without raising his voice. "Mama, come look at this." Boot prints. In the soft earth between the stones, large and iron-heeled, not Dessa's worn leather soles, not children's bare feet. The prints of a working man who wore forge-made heel plates to keep leather from grinding down on rocky ground. They circled the basin twice, then tracked east back toward the ridge road. Wade Pratt, Gideon's foreman. He had been here in the dark, measuring what Dessa had built, mapping it for the man who paid his wages. Clem's voice was careful, precise. "Mama, someone was here at night." "I see it." "Why didn't he break it?" Dessa studied the prints, then looked at the ridge road, then back at her son's face. Breaking another person's property is a crime provable, prosecutable, the kind of thing that follows a man. But telling Pratt what he saw so Pratt can use the law to take what he wants, that's not a crime, that's business. What do? We finish before they finish. That afternoon, Wade rode the ridge road again. The south leg this time, not the north. From the south, the angle of the slope opened beneath him, the hillside revealing what it had concealed for 25 days. The channel. The stone-lined channel running down the north face, and beside it on both sides, 4 feet wide and vivid against everything the drought had done to the surrounding land. A line of green so bright against the brown it looked painted a seam of living color, stitching across 40 acres of dead ground, as if holding 2 halves of a broken world together. Wade sat his horse for exactly half a minute. The animal shifted underneath him, restless. Then he turned hard and rode east at a full gallop, the dust rising behind him, hanging in the windless air for a long time after he had gone. Dessa watched from the root cavity, with Clem pressed against one side of her and Rue against the other. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They waited until the dust settled, until the ridge road was empty in both directions, until the only sound remaining was the spring still running its 3.5 gallons per minute, indifferent to everything except the stone it passed through, which had never in all its long existence underground been indifferent to anything at all. That evening in a house 3 miles east, Wade Pratt delivered his report. Gideon Pratt sat in his parlor while his mother, Patience Pratt, sat in the corner with her grandson, 3 months old, fretful in the heat. Patience was 70 years old, small, iron-spined, with eyes that recorded everything, and a mouth that said only what was necessary. She listened to every word Wade spoke. Pratt's hand tightened on the arm of the chair as the report concluded. His face darkened. Through the wall, Patience could hear the scratch of his pen beginning to move. She looked at her grandson. She looked at Willa, her daughter-in-law, standing in the hallway with her hand on the doorframe, exhausted in the particular way of a woman with an infant and a husband who has stopped hearing the baby cry because he is listening to something else entirely. Patience held Willa's eyes across the room. "Remember this, Willa. Someday you will need a woman like that woman to be kind to you. That day is closer than Gideon thinks it is." On the 87th day of the drought, Gideon Pratt walked into the Boone County Courthouse in Cutter's Bluff and filed 3 documents. A challenge to the homestead claim of Hollis Vane, deceased, a water rights protest alleging that Dessa Vane's spring diverted groundwater from his own property 2 miles east, a demand for an emergency hearing before Judge Aldous Keck. He walked from the courthouse to the steps of Monk's Mercantile and addressed the men who had gathered there in the morning heat looking for any news of water being brought in by rail. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man who has learned that confidence delivered in public with sufficient volume often substitutes convincingly for evidence. A widow in a crater and 2 small children are not the kind of witnesses the state of Arkansas intends to build water law on. I am asking Judge Keck to consider whether a woman with no husband, no resources, and no legal expertise might be mistaken about what she believes she has found. He paused. He let the silence work. These are the stories the desperate tell when they are too proud to accept a fair offer. At the back of the gathered crowd, arms folded across his leather apron, Taft Gruber listened. He did not move. He did not speak. But when Pratt finished and the crowd began to break apart and drift away, Taft walked directly to his forge, took his hammer from its hook and held it in both hands for a long time without striking anything. That night after dark, he took the trail through the hollow, the trail Dessa had told him nobody used. He knocked on the cabin door, and when Dessa opened it, he said the only thing that mattered: Mrs. Vane Pratt has filed a petition. The hearing is Thursday. 2 days. She had 2 days to prepare for a fight she had not been trained to win inside a legal system built by men, operated by men, designed, however unintentionally, to be navigated most successfully by men. She had a logbook, a spring, a notebook written by a dead woman in Tennessee, and a daughter who had once corrected her surveying by 2 inches using a string stretched between 2 pegs. She spent the first morning of those 2 days doing something that would have looked from the ridge road like nothing at all. She walked the channel, all 80 feet of it. She walked it the way a person walks a path they will need to describe precisely under pressure, slowly, deliberately committing every stone and joint and turn to a kind of knowledge that lives in the feet rather than the head, so that the words, when they were needed, would come from somewhere the fear couldn't reach. Then she went inside and opened the oilcloth logbook. She read it from the beginning, every entry, every measurement, every date. She had kept this record because Hattie's notebooks had taught her that the act of writing something down is the act of declaring it real. But reading it now from the outside, she saw what she had been too close to see from within. The handwriting changed across the pages. On day 12, the letters trembled. They leaned, wavered, moved across the lines like something unsure of its footing. By day 20, they had settled. By day 30, the most recent entries, they stood upright, occupying their space on the page, with a quietness she almost didn't recognize as her own. It was not the hand of a woman who was afraid. It was the hand of a woman who had built something she knew would hold. She closed the logbook. She wrapped it in clean cloth. She set it on the table beside Hattie's notebook. That evening she washed her Sunday dress in spring water and hung it on the line to dry in the last light. Rue braided her hair standing on the straw mattress to reach working 3 strands with the focused attention of a surgeon. When she finished, she turned Dessa by the shoulders and examined her work with the critical eye of someone whose professional reputation was at stake. "You look like a lady, Mama." Dessa met her daughter's eyes. "I am a lady, sugar." Rue considered this assessment, then improved upon it. "You look like a lady who is going to win." Clem came to her after Rue had fallen asleep. He reached into his pocket and produced the brass button. He had polished it with spit and the hem of his shirt until the eagle on its face was visible again, the worn stamping catching the candlelight in a way it hadn't in months. He held it out on his palm. "Take Papa with you, Mama." Dessa closed her fingers around it. The eagle pressed into her palm, a small, specific pressure, the kind that keeps you present when your mind tries to drift toward everything that might go wrong. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, directly over her heart. She sat at the table a long time after Clem went back to his mattress. She did not open the notebook. She did not write anything. She simply sat in the quiet of the cabin she had built inside the body of a fallen tree on the land she had decided against every reasonable calculation to keep, and she let the night be what it was. Tomorrow had a shape she could not yet see, but she had built things without being able to see their final shape before. She had learned across 27 days of this work that the shape reveals itself in the doing. You do not need to see the whole channel before you cut the first stone. You only need to know the direction of the slope and trust that water, given the chance, will always find its way down. Reverend Wendell Aldrich arrived Thursday morning on his mule an hour before Judge Keck was expected on the track. 45 years old, gray-bearded, with hands that never fully settled, touching his collar, smoothing his coat front, adjusting his hat brim, as though his body had reached a permanent state of almost departure and could not resolve itself into either arriving or leaving. He was not a bad man. Dessa had known bad men, and Aldrich was not among them. He was a man whose goodness operated within a defined radius, like a lantern that gives light as far as its glass allows, and nowhere beyond. "Mrs. Vane, I know about the hearing. I came because I thought you should be prepared." Dessa stood in the cabin doorway, and her Sunday dress hair braided the brass button in her pocket. Clem stood slightly behind her, with his splinted arm held close to his body, standing straight in the particular way of a boy who has decided that posture is the one thing available to him. Rue stood on the other side of Dessa, already holding a tin cup of spring water, already understanding something about this morning that neither her mother nor her brother had yet named. "Reverend, will you speak for me at the hearing?" Aldrich looked at the ground. He looked at it the way a man looks when he is searching for something he dropped a long time ago and has already accepted he won't find. When he raised his eyes again, they carried the expression of a man who has weighed two things on an interior scale and chosen the heavier one, not because it was right, but because weight in his long experience tends to win. Mrs. Vane, my congregation includes the Pratt family. Placing myself between two members of my flock would not be appropriate. I cannot in good conscience take sides in a civil matter. Dessa studied his face for a moment, then stepped back from the doorway. Would you like some water before you ride back, Reverend? He drank. His hands were not entirely steady around the cup. The water was cold in the particular way of water that has traveled through limestone for longer than any living person can account for, emerging at a temperature the August heat could not touch. Aldrich knew where it came from. He knew what it represented. He knew that what he was swallowing was evidence more persuasive than anything he could offer from a witness stand, evidence that did not require his testimony or his courage or his willingness to stand between a widow and a man with money. He drank it anyway because he was thirsty, and because the distance between knowing what is right and doing what is right is sometimes measured in nothing more dramatic than a cup of water accepted from the person you are failing. He rode away. Dessa watched him go without calling after him. She had learned something at Monk's counter 3 days ago when Mabry's trembling hands had taught her that her disappointment in good people was always the lightest kind of disappointment. It carried no surprise. You cannot be genuinely shocked by the predictable. You can only note it, factor it into your calculations, and adjust the way a builder adjusts for wind when laying a wall, not changing what you're building, only accounting for the force working against it. Judge Aldous Keck rode up the track at 9 o'clock with the county surveyor beside him and the court clerk behind, and Gideon Pratt on his sorrel mare at the rear. The mare was thinner than she had been in July. 2 faint lines showed along her ribs, the first visible evidence the drought had reached Pratt's barn, that the distance between his situation and everyone else's had begun to close. Dessa met them in the yard. Keck was 55, weathered, with the face of a man who had spent 3 decades listening to people explain why they deserved things and had developed the capacity to hear what they were actually saying underneath the words. He had known Hollis Vane, had witnessed Hollis's homestead filing at the land office, had shaken his hand across the clerk's desk and wished him well on the land. Rue stepped forward before anyone dismounted. She held the tin cup up toward Keck with both hands steady, serious, offering it the way you offer something you understand to be valuable. Keck looked down at the child from the saddle. He took the cup with both hands, drank, and set it on the porch rail with deliberate care. He looked at Dessa over the rim before he drank, and what passed across his face in that moment was not judgment, but recognition, the look of a man who is beginning to understand what kind of morning this is going to be. Mrs. Vane, may I see the spring? She walked him down the hillside. The surveyor brought his measuring chain and brass level. Keck moved along the length of the channel, slowly stopping twice to crouch and examine the stonework, running his fingers along the joints between flat limestone slabs, the way a man runs his fingers along the seam of a well-made coat, checking not the surface but the integrity beneath it. At the end of the channel, he stood at the edge of the garden and did not speak for a long time. 30 by 40 feet, 8 rows. The corn at the north end stood 8 feet tall, the ears fat in their husks, the silk at the top turning brown in the way that means ready. Bean vines climbed the corn stalks in green spirals. Squash ran along the middle rows, broad leaves shading the ground beneath them, fruit hanging heavy. At the southern end, where the sun was most direct, tomatoes the size of a man's fist were ripening their skins, moving from green to red in a gradient so orderly it looked deliberate, as though someone had painted them that way to make a point that words alone could not. Keck looked at the garden. He looked at the channel. He looked at the stone basin and the spring crater and the root wall rising behind it. He looked at the fallen oak, still impossibly green, stretched across the property in its long repose. He looked last at Dessa. "Ma'am, have you kept any record of your use of this water?" She brought out the oilcloth logbook. Keck opened it. He read, standing in the sun for 15 minutes, turning pages with a care that suggested he understood he was holding something that exceeded its own category, not merely a record of gallons and inches, but evidence of a particular kind of intelligence applied under pressure that most people with every advantage available never managed to demonstrate. The surveyor measured the channel gradient with his brass level, calling numbers to the clerk in a flat professional voice. The clerk recorded them without looking up. Pratt stood apart from all of it, jaw-tight, hands clasped behind his back. On the ridge road above, visible to the entire proceeding, but acknowledged by no one, Taft Gruber stood beside his horse. He had not been invited. He had no legal standing. He had no testimony to offer and no role in the proceedings beyond being physically present. He was simply there, the way a fence post marks a boundary, visible, silent, serving no purpose except to indicate that a line exists and that someone considered it worth marking. Pratt saw him. Wade Pratt, standing behind Gideon's horse, saw him too. Neither of them said anything. Both of them filed it away. Keck closed the logbook. He turned toward Pratt with the unhurried composure of a man who has already reached his conclusion and is about to share it at the pace he chooses. "Mr. Pratt, your petition claims this spring diverts groundwater from your property 2 miles east. Is that correct?" Pratt stepped forward. His coat was buttoned despite the heat. His watch chain caught the light. He held himself the way he always held himself, upright, certain, carrying the posture of a man accustomed to rooms that arrange themselves around him. "It is your honor. The county surveyor has measured the elevation of your well against the elevation of this spring." Keck let the pause do its work. The silence after a prepared statement in his long experience was more uncomfortable than any contradiction. "Your well sits 47 feet higher in elevation than this spring on the opposite side of a solid limestone ridge. Groundwater does not flow uphill, Mr. Pratt. It does not pass through solid limestone formations. You know this." Something shifted behind Pratt's eyes, not visible in any single feature, but present in the aggregate, the way a structure shows stress before it fails. A recalculation. The specific internal adjustment of a man who has been counting on a particular card and has just watched someone else play it. "Furthermore," Keck continued, his voice carrying no particular emphasis, carrying only the weight of what was true, "Mrs. Vane has made visible, continuous, and beneficial use of this water for 43 days. The Homestead Act provides that a widow may complete her husband's claim by continuing the required improvements. Mrs. Vane has done so." He handed the logbook back to Dessa. His hands were careful with it the way you are careful with something that belongs to someone else and matters to them. "Your petition is denied, Mr. Pratt. Your protest is dismissed. The claim stands." He tipped his hat to Dessa. "I'm very sorry about Hollis. He was a good man. You are a good woman. I'm glad to have been of use to you today." He mounted his horse and rode back toward Cutter's Bluff. The surveyor followed. The clerk followed. The sound of their horses faded into the dry August air. And then there was only the spring and the wind moving through the crown of the fallen oak and the breathing of people who had been holding their breath for a very long time. Pratt did not ride back immediately. He stood on Dessa's hillside for a full minute after Keck disappeared around the ridge. He looked at the channel. He looked at the garden. His mouth moved, words forming, dissolving, forming again, an entire sentence being constructed and demolished and constructed again without ever making it into the air. In the end, he said none of them, because none of them were adequate, and some part of him that had not yet fully surrendered to the rest of him already knew it. He mounted the sorrel. The mare stepped sideways, hungry, thirsty, unhappy, in the bone-deep way of animals whose care has fallen below what they require. Pratt corrected her with the reins harder than the moment called for, and Dessa watched the horse flinch and understood what she was seeing when a man's authority collapses. In one place, the force of it has to go somewhere else, and it almost always goes somewhere smaller than itself. He rode east. He did not look back. He did not go home. He went to the farm 3 miles east, 40 head of cattle, and a sulfur creek the cattle had refused to drink from for 2 weeks because the water had gone rancid in the sustained heat. Willa Pratt and their 3-month-old son had been living there with patience, and the house had grown quieter each day. In the particular way houses grow quiet when the people inside them are running out of options simultaneously. Wade met him at the gate. 17 cattle had gone down in the pasture that morning. 9 had not gotten back up. The rest stood in available shade with their heads low, breathing the way things breathe when breathing has become the last effort they are willing to make. Willa was on the porch with the baby. The infant's face was flushed and dry. It had not produced water since sunrise. The sound it was making had moved past crying into something smaller and more alarming, a thin, intermittent whimper, the sound of a body conserving what little it had left to spend. Pratt went into the kitchen. He sat at his table. He put his head in his hands. Patience stood in his doorway and watched her son. She had said everything available to her to say the night Wade brought his report about the green line stitching across Dessa Vane's hillside. The words had landed where they landed. Repeating them would not change the landing. He came at dusk. He walked the 2 miles because the sorrel could no longer carry him that distance in the heat. He walked beside the buggy because the buggy horse could still pull the empty vehicle, but not a man's weight sitting in it. Willa drove. She held the baby against her chest. The baby had been silent for an hour. The silence was worse than the whimpering because at least the whimpering meant something remained to spend. Dessa saw them on the track from the cabin doorway, 2 figures in the failing light, one walking beside the horse, one on the buggy seat holding a shape that was too still. She looked at them the way she had learned to look at things clearly, without the distortion of what she wanted to see or feared to see. Clem stood up from where he had been sitting on the threshold. His uninjured hand went to the doorframe, steadying himself against what he recognized. "That's him, Mama. I see him, sugar." His voice was low-controlled, carrying everything he had felt on the morning of day 1 when Pratt had set his silver-barreled pen on Hollis's table. "He tried to take our home. He called you ignorant in front of everyone in Cutter's Bluff. I was standing right there. I heard every word he said." A pause waited with the full moral clarity of an 8-year-old who has just survived 30 days of near-impossible work. "Don't open that door for him." Rue came and stood between them. She was already holding the tin cup. It was her job in this house carrying water, and she had understood before either of them what was happening on the track below. She had seen what Dessa hadn't yet named and what Clem was refusing to name. A woman on a buggy seat, holding an infant that wasn't moving enough. A man walking beside a horse because the horse couldn't carry him. The arithmetic of what that meant was not complicated, and Rue had always been good at arithmetic. But Mama... Her voice was small in the way that small voices carry farthest. "Mrs. Pratt is crying, and the baby is hot." Dessa stood in the doorway. She was not deciding. She was not hesitating. She was remembering. She was remembering Hollis, who would have carried water to anyone who asked, who had once given the coat off his back to a man who had cheated him on a timber deal, because Hollis believed that what you do for people who have wronged you reveals more about you than what you do for people who have not. She was remembering grandmother Hattie in a Tennessee kitchen. When Dessa was 11 years old, a man at the door with his hat in his hands, a man who had cost them money. They couldn't spare 2 years before asking for bread. Hattie reaching for the bread box without breaking her stride, saying, "Show them who you are, sugar, not who they made you." She was remembering the splint on Clem's arm, the cup in Rue's hand. 87 days of drought. $30 on the pine table. A silver-barreled pen she had not touched. Willa's voice reached her from the track, stripped of everything except the single thing that mattered, the voice of a woman who has already put down everything she had been carrying except her child. "Mrs. Vane, my mother-in-law told me that someday I would need a woman like you to be kind to me. She was right. Please, the baby is very weak." Dessa walked down the hill. Pratt was standing at the edge of the property line. The day's beard on his jaw collar, open neck, sunburned to cracking. When he saw her coming down the slope, he stopped moving entirely. He put one hand on the side of the buggy to hold himself upright, and the hand was shaking, and he made no effort to conceal it. The man who had set a silver-barreled pen on her table and waited for her to understand the game was already decided, was now standing on her land in the failing light, holding himself up against a buggy wheel with a hand he could not steady. "Mrs. Vane, I'll pay $5 a bucket. Whatever you want to charge. $5 for my boy, for Willa." Dessa walked past him without answering. She went to the channel. She knelt in the grass beside the last section, the 12 feet she had finished the afternoon. Rue told her Papa would be proud. She dipped the cedar bucket into the flow. The water was cold, cleaner than anything on this hillside had any right to be in the middle of a 104-day drought. She lifted the bucket and carried it to the buggy and passed it up to Willa. "Wet a cloth and put it on his face first. Not his mouth yet. Small sips after. His body will absorb the water faster if the skin learns it's coming." Willa took the bucket with both hands and began to cry so hard she couldn't hold it. Dessa reached up and held the bucket for her, standing beside the buggy wheel with her arms extended, taking the weight of the water while Willa tried to breathe. Dessa untied her apron, the apron she had been wearing the morning Pratt set his pen on Hollis's table, tore a strip from the hem, dipped it in the bucket, reached up and laid it across the baby's forehead herself. The cloth darkened with the water. The infant's skin was hot enough that Dessa felt the heat through the wet fabric. She held the cloth in place. 1 minute. The baby's eyelids moved. Its mouth opened. 2 minutes. Its eyes came open, unfocused, blinking in the remaining light. Dessa stepped back from the buggy. She turned to Pratt. 10 cents a bucket, Mr. Pratt. Same as every person who has come to this hillside in the past 3 weeks. Same price the Heenan widow pays. She lost her husband in the spring. Same price Reverend Aldrich pays for his wife's kitchen garden. Same price for you. She held his eyes. She did not look away. You don't owe me $5. I won't take 10 cents tonight. Take as many buckets as the buggy will carry. Next week, every week for as long as the drought lasts, 10 cents a bucket. Pratt stared at her. His mouth opened. Something was happening behind his face that had no name in the vocabulary he had built across a lifetime of transactions. Something structural, a wall coming down that had been load-bearing the interior rearrangement of a man who has spent his entire life believing he understood the categories of people, who has organized everything he knows around the axis of strong and weak, winner and loser, sensible and ignorant, and is now standing in front of a woman who does not fit any column he has ever built. She has no obligation to give him what she is giving him. She is charging him exactly what she charges everyone, not less from pity, not more from justice. He does not know where to put that. He has never needed a column for it before. I don't have the 10 cents with me today, Mrs. Vane. I rode out without my wallet. Dessa turned back toward the channel. Pay me Friday. Take the buckets. Go home, Mr. Pratt. Your wife needs to get that child somewhere cool before the sun finishes setting. He filled the buckets himself. He knelt on the stones of the channel in his charcoal coat with the dust ground into the hem, and dipped the cedar bucket with his own hands, and he carried 4 buckets to the buggy. And when he walked back beside Willa in the last of the light, he was a man of different proportions than the man who had ridden up this track in July. At the track he turned once. He was not wearing a hat. He had come without one. He bowed his head slowly, deeply, the way a man bows in a church when he means it rather than performing it. And Dessa understood that this was the first genuinely honest thing she had ever seen Gideon Pratt do. Not calculated, not weighed against cost or return, not measured against what it would earn him or what it would cost. A man bowing his head to a woman who had given him something he had not earned and had not charged him extra for the not earning. She watched them go until the buggy disappeared around the ridge, until the sound of the horse faded out entirely, until the hillside was quiet except for the spring. Then she turned and went back up the slope. Clem was standing at the cabin door. His uninjured hand hung at his side. His face was doing the work of a boy trying to locate the correct response to something that does not fit inside the categories he has built for the world. His voice, when it came, was genuinely searching. "Mama, why did you help him?" Dessa sat down on the cabin threshold. She pulled Clem into her lap, splint and all, and looked out at the fallen oak, the green length of it lying across her land in the dusk, the channel running down from the root wall, the thin, bright line of grass where the water traveled to the garden. "Because we are not the people he thought we were. I will not let him make us into them." Clem was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "Is that what Grandma Hattie meant?" "That is exactly what Grandma Hattie meant." Rue came and leaned against Dessa's other side. The 3 of them sat in the doorway while the last light left the hillside. The spring murmured below them. The garden was invisible in the gathering dark, but they could smell it. The green, wet smell of things growing, of corn and turned earth and water meeting heat. The smell that is not hope exactly, but is what hope grows in when it has sufficient water. "Mama." Rue, half asleep against Dessa's arm. "Yes, sugar." "Mrs. Pratt said God help us. Will God help them?" Dessa put her cheek on the top of Rue's head, feeling the warmth of her daughter's skull. "God already did, baby. He sent a storm in July." The first rain came on the 11th of October. It fell on a Sunday afternoon, and it fell for 11 hours, and when it stopped, the drought had broken on its 104th day. Dessa, Clem, and Rue stood in the cabin doorway with the door open and watched the water pooling in the cracked earth beyond the green zone, soaking into ground that had forgotten it was capable of receiving anything. The spring continued at 3.5 gallons per minute, indifferent to the rain as springs are. It had its own reasons for running. Weather was not among them. By December, Dessa had $127 in the tin on the high shelf. 10 cents a bucket had accumulated with the same slow, reliable arithmetic as the drought itself. Pratt had paid $3.40 by the end of September, carrying the coins up the track himself on 4 separate Fridays, setting them on the threshold without words, walking back down. Dessa logged each payment in the oilcloth record exactly as she logged every other customer name, date, amount. She did not mention it to the children because there was nothing requiring mention. A debt settled is a door closed. You don't stand in front of a closed door discussing what used to be behind it. In January, she rode the stage to Little Rock with Hollis's homestead paperwork and Hattie's notebook in a flour sack on her lap and Clem's hand in hers. The land office clerk read the file, read the oilcloth logbook, asked 2 questions about channel gradient and spring flow rate, then signed the land patent without further discussion. 40 acres. Dessa Vane. Her name. Her signature. The land was hers, the way her hands were hers. Not because someone had given them to her, but because she had used them until they were capable of the work required, and there was no longer any question about whether the capability was real. The clerk let Clem press the county seal into the hot wax himself. It was a small thing. Clem would remember it for the rest of his life, the weight of the brass seal in his 9-year-old hand, the heat of the wax, the sound the metal made pressing down a soft, firm sound that meant something was finished. The following spring, Mabry Sutton walked up the track carrying a shawl she had knitted across the winter cream-colored wool with a cable pattern at the border made with the specific compensatory care of a person whose hands need to produce something decent while their mind works through something that cannot be undone. She stood on the threshold and held it out with both hands and did not step inside. "Dessa, I'm not asking forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I want you to know that I'm ashamed." Dessa looked at the shawl. She looked at Mabry. She looked at the lines of the older woman's face and at the way she was holding the shawl extended, offered, fully prepared to absorb a refusal, without argument, already standing in the posture of someone who has made peace with consequences. "Come in, Mabry." They sat beside the spring basin in the morning sun and drank from tin cups and did not speak much. The silence between them was not the kind Clem had taught her about, the full silence, the trust silence. This was different. This was the silence of 2 women who had gone through something separately that they should have endured together, sitting in the same place now. Not because everything had been repaired, but because sitting beside each other was the first act of repair available to them. When Mabry rose to leave, Dessa said, "You were frightened. Everyone was frightened. What matters is that you're here now." Mabry cried on the walk home. By summer, she was arriving at the hillside each morning with a ledger book of her own, keeping the water accounts for the farms west of the ridge, collecting dimes in a coffee tin. Her movements carrying something that was equal parts penance and genuine pride in work that mattered. Pratt's speculative business failed in its 2nd year. Too many loans extended against land that had depreciated below the price he had paid, a structure that required everything to keep rising and could not survive the moment things simply stopped. He and Willa and the boy and Patience moved to St. Louis. He sent Dessa a letter the Christmas after the move. 3 lines on plain paper, no letterhead, no embossing. "Mrs. Vane, our son is doing well. My wife sends her regards. I am not the man I was that July, and I owe you the life of my child. Gideon Pratt." Dessa placed the letter inside the front cover of Hattie's notebook between the leather and the first written page. She showed it to no one. She read it twice each year for the rest of her life, once at Christmas when it arrived in memory, once in July when the anniversary came around. Each time she thought the same thing, that 3 lines from a man who had tried to take everything weighed more than 300 pages, from a man who had never tried anything at all. The weight of words is not in how many there are. It's in what it costs the person to finally write them. 7 of Dessa's neighbors eventually reclaimed the properties Pratt had purchased at distressed prices during the drought year. Dessa lent each of them the down payment from her water money at the same plain interest rate the First Bank of Cutter's Bluff charged, not less, not more. Not one of them was ever late. In the 5th year after the drought, Dessa stood before the Boone County Grange on a February evening and was asked to say a few words about her hillside. She had not expected to be asked. She had not prepared anything because she had not yet understood that she was the kind of woman who gave speeches, and the discovery happened at the same moment as the speech itself, which is, she would later think, how most important discoveries work. She wore a new wool dress. Rue had braided her hair. 40 people in the room, farmers, their wives, the Reverend monks, the storekeeper. people who had watched from a careful distance for 5 years and were now hearing her voice for the first time in a room where she wasn't defending anything or asking for anything but simply saying what she knew. The biggest tree in dry country is drinking from somewhere deep. That's what my grandmother taught me when I was a girl. The tree is not the problem. The tree is the map. Find the tallest, oldest, greenest tree on a hillside where nothing else is growing, and I promise you that tree has its roots in water you can't see from the surface. What that tree is drinking you can drink too if you know how to ask the land. She paused. The room stayed quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet, when the person speaking has said something that needs a moment to settle before anything else can be added to it. The second thing I'd say is this: what people call worthless is usually only hidden. You don't always have to build something from nothing. Sometimes you have to uncover what was already there. Sometimes the ground will open itself to you and all you're asked to do is have the wit to notice. The Grange printed both passages in its spring newsletter. By autumn, they had reached the newsletters of 4 adjoining counties. By the 10th year after the drought, men Dessa had never met were quoting them in Grange halls across Arkansas and into Kentucky as old country wisdom passed down through generations. Dessa, when she heard this, did not correct anyone. The words had done what true words do when they are finally released. They had let go of the person who first said them and become the property of everyone who needed to hear them, which is the only form of immortality that costs nothing to give away. Clem was 18 the year of the Grange talk. By that age, he was already spending 2 mornings a week with younger farmers, teaching them to read a hillside for water, where to look when everything goes brown. What the green that stays green is trying to tell you how to listen to the land, the way his mother had listened, the way her grandmother had listened before that. He had learned this on a night when he was 8 years old, working by moonlight with stones in his hands, trying to give his mother an extra hour of sleep. Rue married at 19 and built her first home on the adjoining slope with her husband following the pattern without being asked. The back wall of their cabin set into the upturned root ball of a storm-felled elm, a small spring rising in the crater, a channel running down to their garden. When their first daughter was born, they named her Hattie. Dessa held the infant on the porch of that new cabin and looked out at the 2 hillsides, the 2 channels running, the 2 green lines moving across the land, and understood that this was what inheritance looked like when it worked correctly. Not money, not paper recorded in a land office. A way of seeing passed from hand to hand, the way you pass a cup of water to someone who needs it, which is the only way anything worth keeping ever moves between people. Dessa never remarried. Hollis had been her husband. Hattie had been her teacher. Her children were her children. The oak on the hillside was her oak. The cabin inside the root cavity stood for as long as Dessa did, 41 more years. Moss grew on the root wall. Ferns came each spring from between the roots, their fronds unfurling slowly against the dark earth. By the end, the wall was indistinguishable from the hillside it had emerged from. The earth had taken it back, which is not a loss but a completion. When Dessa was an old woman, she went to the market in Cutter's Bluff on a September morning. The square was full: wagons, horses, children cutting between the stalls, the smells of apples and wood smoke and new leather mixing in the fall air. At the feed store, a young farmer was talking to the man beside him, leaning against the counter with the confident ease of someone sharing knowledge he believes to be ancient and settled and beyond revision. My daddy always said the biggest tree in dry country is drinking from somewhere deep. He did not look at her. She was an old woman buying flour, and old women buying flour are invisible in feed stores, which suited Dessa entirely. She had never been interested in being seen. She had been interested in being useful, and those 2 things are not the same. The distance between them is the distance between the man who builds something with his name on it and the woman who builds something that works. Where did your daddy learn that, son? He looked at her with the mild courtesy a young man produces for an elder he does not know. Old country saying, ma'am. My daddy's daddy used to tell it. Dessa paid for her flour. She smiled at him, a small, private smile, the smile of a woman who is in possession of information the room has not been given and has decided this is exactly the correct arrangement. She walked out into the bright September afternoon, crossed the square, found her mule at the post, rode home to her hillside. She sat down on the cabin threshold. The wood was warm from the sun, the root wall behind her cool, smelling of moss and deep stone. She could hear the spring running below. She could hear the channel. She could hear faintly a bird in the crown of a young sycamore that had grown up beside the fallen oak, over the decades a new tree, drinking from the same source, a new cup on the same table. She opened Hattie's notebook. She turned to the last page, to the entries she had written there in the darkness of the 9th day. And in the grief of the morning, Clem was hurt the words she had written to Hattie, the words she had written to Hollis. Below those entries, in the space that remained, she wrote in the hand she had finally grown into, the steady, spare, unhurried hand of a woman who had run out of time for anything except what was true. A grandmother in Tennessee, a tree in a storm, a daughter who finally learned to read what was already there. She closed the notebook. She set it on her lap. She looked out at the hillside, at the green line of the channel, at the garden in its late-season fullness, at the long body of the oak, returning slowly to the earth it had come from, which was not an ending but a continuation by other means. The brass button was in the pocket of her dress, directly over her heart, where it had been since the morning Clem polished it and asked her to take his father along. She had taken him. She had taken all of them, Hattie and Hollis and Clem and Rue and Mabry and Taft and even Pratt. Especially Pratt. Because you cannot build a life without accounting for the people who tried to dismantle it. They become part of the structure. They are the weight the walls were built to hold, and walls built to hold weight are always stronger than walls built in its absence. Dessa Vane sat on the threshold of her cabin on her hillside in Harlan Ridge, Arkansas, and watched the afternoon light move across 40 acres that bore her name on a piece of paper in a land office in Little Rock. The spring ran, the channel carried, the garden grew. Somewhere in a feed store in Cutter's Bluff, a young man who had never met her was telling his neighbor an old country saying. That was not old, not country, not a saying in any conventional sense. It was a woman. It was a grandmother. It was a storm that came in the night and knocked down the thing that had been keeping the water hidden. It was a cup offered to a man who had not earned it at a price that was fair on a hillside where the largest tree had finally fallen and the water had come up to meet the light. Which is what water has always done, given half a chance. Which is what people do too when someone builds them the right channel and gets out of the way.